Welcome everyone to Book at Lunchtime for week 7 of Michaelmas term 2022. This is the last session for this term. For those of you who are new to Book at Lunchtime from Torch, it's worth saying that this is one of our longest standing flagship events. We have films of every single event dating back to 2013. So Book at Lunchtime has a growing heritage and indeed archive, as well as a present identity. The podcasts and videos of all of our previous discussions are a popular feature of the website and the YouTube channel, and we've been privileged to feature an astonishing variety of books and authors over the years. Please do visit the YouTube channel if you want to get a sense of that, if you want to see more. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to the Torch newsletter, which will keep you informed of everything that's going across the entirety of Torch. As you all know, I hope, Torch is a hub for interdisciplinary activity across the humanities faculties, from students through to postgraduates through to academics. Today we're discussing a book which crosses many of those faculties, many of those so-called boundaries, and also reaches out to many beyond. As one review, and I've only chosen one, states, ranging expertly from literature to street art, film to parkour, the author brilliantly draws together architecture, urbanism, philosophy, biology, and social history to reveal the stakes of living in the modern city. A compelling achievement. And I hope I'm not going to steal Nikolai and Holly's thunder by saying this, but I also really thought this was a wonderful book, not least in the way that it's structured, in that it gives you a sense really of what it is to live in a city. And the way in which the sort of the various aspects of the work are set out. I'll leave you to talk about that in more detail. Really, I completely agree that it's not just about, it's not a description of the city, it's about what it's revealing the stakes of living in a city. So, I'm delighted then to welcome Dr. Max Smith of the Queen's College to discuss this fascinating work, Paris and the Parasite. Max is joined by Dr. Holly Langstaff, my colleague at St Edmund Hall. Thank you, Holly, for being here. And Professor Nikolai Lübecker from St John's College, also my colleague, insofar as I should declare an interest that I'm a professor of French as well as Torch director. Nikolai, I'll just introduce briefly and then he will introduce the other members of our panel. So Nikolai is Professor of French at St John's College, has research interests that lie in the fields of modern French and comparative literature, film studies, and intellectual history. At present, he's particularly interested in texts and films that can inspire us to think about the impact of recent technological and ecological developments in our societies. In other words, right on message for quite a bit of what's in this, the book that we're about to discuss. We look forward to an excellent and wide-ranging discussion today. Regulars will know that the whole event lasts for about an hour. There'll be some discussion between the panelists, and then we'll open it up to those of us who are in the audience, and that's going to include me while I go and sit down in the audience. And over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Wes, for the invitation and for the presentation as well. So, as Wes said, I'm Nikolai Lübecker, and I'm really happy to be here today to celebrate Max's brilliant book, Paris and the Parasite. And I'll just start by introducing Holly first and then Max. So Holly is a stipendiary lecturer at St Edmund Hall and St Anne's College in French. And her research is mainly concerned with the work of Maurice Blanchot, so a 20th century French writer. And her first monograph, Art and Technology in Maurice Blanchot, will be published by Edinburgh University Press a little bit, August 2023. And Holly is not just a researcher and a teacher, she's also a judge for the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize. She runs the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation and the Anthea Bell Prize for Young Translators at the Queen's College Translation Exchange. And the star of this show is Dr. Max Smith. He's a career development fellow in French at Queen's College, Oxford. His research concerns the intersection of media and the body. And he is, of course, the author of Paris and the Parasite, which grew out of a doctoral dissertation that he started and finished at Princeton University. He has published articles on the spread of disease in Camus' La Peste, and street art's engagement with cultural references as varied and as Dante's Divine Comedy and the 1871 Paris Commune. And his next book project concerns the use of media technologies in contemporary French theatre and its effect on the conceptualization of the body in French performance theory. So Wes has already said a little bit about the program, but what we'll do now is we'll begin by reading from the book. So Max is going to read from the book. Then Holly and I will offer some thoughts on the book, and I will go first, we decided, and then Holly will follow, and Max will get a chance to respond to those reflections before we speak among ourselves for a bit of time, and then around 1:45, we hope that you'll be asking questions, and we will wrap up by 2:00. So Max, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the very, very kind introductions. I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, which hopefully explains what's at stake in it. In February of 2016, the municipal government of Paris published a Plan de prévention du bruit dans l'environnement, or Plan for the Prevention of Noise in the Environment, the PPBE. The document opens with two observations. First, that polls have shown growing levels of concern about noise amongst Parisians, and second, that noise represents, quote, the second most important environmental influence on human health after air pollution, end quote. The document lays out a 5-year plan consisting of 39 measures to quiet the soundscape of the city. The PPBE acknowledges that the line between sound and noise is fuzzy. Noise is subjective. It is one person's experience of a sound at a given moment. Music coming through the wall of my neighbor's apartment is sound if I'm in a mood to listen to it, and noise if I'm not. Traffic, birdsong, and voices in the street might be perceived as pleasant signs of a vibrant city, or they might not. There's nothing in the sound waves themselves that can tell us how a sound will be perceived by a listener. Parisians might be increasingly worried about noise, but what each of them thinks of as noise might be different. By stating this, the PPBE undermines its premise right from the start. If there's no objective definition for noise, then what is there to regulate? If the meaning of noise can change for a given person from moment to moment, then the government seems to be taking on the task of imposing a normative aesthetic standard on the urban soundscape and then policing citizens' personal experience of it. The PPBE tries to dodge this trap by turning to the International Organization for Standardization, which defines noise according to the, quote, sensation it produces. That word can be interpreted physiologically as well as emotionally, opening up the possibility of an objective definition of noise based not on the listener's mood or artistic tastes, but on the effect the sound has on their body. So sound can therefore be defined as noise if it harms the listener's body in a detectable way. With this definition in hand, the PPBE proceeds to argue that noise is a health issue, and indeed that Paris is experiencing a public health crisis. Noise, the report states, raises stress levels, worsens cardiovascular health, and interrupts sleep, leading to a host of secondary health issues. Playing up the environmental part of the title, the PPBE repeatedly ties noise to air pollution, saying that vehicles that emit less CO2 also emit less noise, and comparing the quiet of green spaces and parks to the clean air the trees provide. So readers are led to assume that reducing noise in the city will also indirectly benefit their lungs. In interviews conducted after the release of the report, Célia Blouel, the adjoint to the mayor in charge of the environment, cited the statistic that 10,000 deaths in Europe per year are caused by noise. Quote, beyond questions of comfort and quality of life, she said, the acoustic environment constitutes a public health concern, end quote. Public health is not the only reason to care about urban noise. Noise also has a socio-political dimension, according to the PPBE. It is an important factor in social segregation, it says, as the rich buy homes in quiet neighborhoods while the poor are exposed to harmful soundscapes, disadvantaging them for life. And how the government proposes to manage noise likewise directly concerns the social politics of the city. Many of the suggested interventions center around the commute, and in particular, how residents of the banlieue, Paris's suburbs, get into and out of the city center. Reducing automobile traffic may reduce noise, but for people who rely on cars to access the city center, a reduction in traffic is a threat to what Henri Lefebvre calls their right to the city. This side of things is all the more fraught given the historic power and wealth imbalance between the center of Paris and the suburbs. The Boulevard Périphérique, Paris's ring road, features prominently in the PPBE. Because it marks the limits of Paris proper, lying in the footprint of the city's last defensive walls, The périphérique is a symbol of the difficult relationship between central Paris and the banlieue. The PPBE's proposals to quiet the highway, for instance by burying it underground, constitute symbolic renegotiations of the boundaries of the city. So how the city proposes to manage noise thus opens questions of who is allowed into the city and who has a right to its resources. I'm not going to discuss the merits of the policies put forth in the PPBE. My interest lies instead with the discourses it deploys. The document begins with a question about the soundscape of the city, about what sounds are desirable and what constitutes noise. And that quickly becomes a question about urban hygiene and about the sociopolitics of the city. The discursive overlap of noise, hygiene, and the sociopolitical that we see in the PPBE is exemplary of the pattern Michel Serres identifies in the Parasite. The word parasite, in French, le parasite, has 4 meanings. The first is a vestigial meaning taken from the original ancient Greek usage, a poor person allowed to eat at a rich man's feast, an unwelcome guest, from parasitos, to eat alongside. The second is a sociopolitical meaning, the mooch who lives off another person's labor. The third is the biological sense of an organism that lives in and off a host organism. And finally, there is a mediatic sense, noise or interference in mediation. Serres sees these 4 definitions as deeply connected. To use one is to activate them all. We see this in the PPBE, where a discussion of acoustic noise, a mediatic parasite, cannot help bringing into relief 2 other kinds of parasite, the biological and the social. Serres argues that all of the various meanings of parasite are expressions of a single conceptual framework, the desire for order. A parasite is simply that which threatens the order of a system. The unwelcome guest disturbs the boundaries of the home, the mooch upsets the economic system, the organismal parasite erodes the bodily integrity of its host, and noise disrupts clarity in communication, thereby undermining the premise that rational thinking produces clear ideas and ordered systems of thought. Serres' overarching argument is that Western modernity is founded on the privileging of order and the concomitant pathologization of anything that threatens it. Western modernity is anti-parasitic. It identifies parasites and purges them to create well-organized, efficient, high-fidelity systems. A parasite is always defined in relation to a host, so if Western modernity is anti-parasitic, it is also pro-host. It creates the conditions for rational and autonomous subjects, the owners of the property and knowledge from which the parasites are banished. This project is flawed, Serres writes, because parasites can never be purged from a system. Quote, "There are channels, and thus there must be noise, no channel without noise," end quote. His argument is as austere as the second law of thermodynamics. There is no system immune to entropy. As Serres sees it, Western modernity is thus built on a mendacious promise, a kind of epistemological Ponzi scheme, where debts are passed on but never paid, where parasites are continually displaced but never eradicated, where hosts think they've been made whole but never truly are. My argument over the course of this book will be that Parisian urbanism and urban politics are dominated by just such anti-parasitism. The pathologization of acoustic noise that we find in the PPBE is but a recent example of a long-standing project to rid the city of its parasites. In this project, the politics of media overlap in complex ways with biopolitics and sociopolitics. Sometimes, as we will see, concerns about epidemic disease are used to justify interventions in media or politics. Sometimes a social group is depicted as diseased outsiders or a cacophonous rabble whose demands don't make sense. Sometimes mediatic clarity is presented as an unproblematic virtue, preempting debate about the social and political side effects of its pursuit. Consistent with Serres' argument, the eradication of Paris's parasites has never been realized and can never be realized. It is an unending dialectic. Through the identification and pathologization of endless parasites, the city's hosts are constituted and reconstituted. This is a violent process, and I will contend that its stakes need to be critically reevaluated.
Thank you very much, Max. I'm going to deliver the first response, then I'm going to speak first of all about why I think this is such a stimulating and fantastic book. And then at the end, I'll move on to a couple of questions that I hope that Max can use to develop and present some of the important ideas of the book, or you can maybe speak around them and focus on Holly's observations if you want to do that. But the first thing I wanted to say is that I loved how generous the book is. So it covers quite a long time period, from the first decades of the 19th century to the present. But more importantly, this is a book that engages with different forms of expression, different media. So Max in this book is reading novels, he's reading poetry, film, philosophy, sociology, and street art. He's analyzing architecture, situationist derives, which are kind of a form of walking in the city, social protest movements, and activities such as parkour. And rather than offering a historical narrative about these various mediatic forms, he's bringing these activities into dialogue, for instance, allowing parkour to shed light on experimental writing and vice versa. And these constellations never feel artificial, and they're always illuminating. The common ground is Paris and French culture, but this is not Paris as a capital of the 19th century. Instead, the book offers a fresh and contemporary Paris, also when Max is writing about Victor Hugo and Haussmann. And that feels liberating because Paris is often presented as a 19th century postcard. And as a consequence of that, the field of French studies frequently feels rather antiquated when it concerns itself with Paris. This is a book that made me feel very optimistic about the future of French studies. If Max and avoid kind of the well-known, it's also, I think, partly because he has at least one foot in media studies. And here I think it's relevant to cite the definition that Mark Hansen and W.J.T. Mitchell give of this term. So they emphasize that media are about mediation, and mediation is about relationality. Therefore, and this is a quote from Mitchell and Hansen, they write that media studies can and should designate the study of our fundamental relationality, of the irreducible role of mediation in the history of human beings. So this is not a source that Max is referring to, but he works, I think, along similar lines. For instance, writing that, and this is a quote from Max, media are inherently relational. So in other words, Paris and the Parasite offers a study of relationality. How can a city which is in itself a kind of medium, a form of relationality, be organized in such a way as to foster relations that are characterized by hospitality and generosity? Relations where the parasite is no longer an enemy, where we no longer seek to marginalize noise, strangers, others, where all of these are allowed to play the role they can play in revitalizing social relations. And Max's analysis show that too often Paris and people working in Paris, for instance Le Corbusier, have been too keen to exclude, to tidy up, to eliminate noise, for instance. And furthermore, he shows that these attempts at tidying up betray a very limited and defensive understanding of what an individual might be, the individual basically being someone who is distinct and closed off from the other. So ultimately, Max's book argues not only for a different conception of how to live together, but also for a different understanding of what it means to be human. As Max writes on page 19, his book asks, what is the status of the individual? What do we understand by collective life? So clearly, this is not just a generous book full of intelligent and stimulating readings of various forms of media. It's also a really ambitious text concerned with relationality and the status of the individual. So from that kind of short presentation of Max's brilliant book, I'm going to move on to a few questions and propositions. And I have two of those, basically. And the first of these concerns the relation between the parasite framework that you kind of work with throughout the volume, and then what you say about literarity at the end of the book. So that's another conceptual framework that you bring in towards the end of the book. And I think that I'm in part looking for a clarification, or just kind of inviting you to expand a little bit on what you're saying there. And in part, when I read you, I got inspired to make a suggestion, so I'm going to make that, and I don't think you can possibly develop anything very sophisticated on the spot, but I want to make it nevertheless. So throughout the book, you're drawing on Michel Serres, as we just heard, and his famous work on parasites. And as he writes, parasites and noise cannot be eliminated. And you read that passage just a moment ago. Noise is also what makes communication possible. This framework is also taken up by Jacques Derrida, and he's excited by the instability of the setup with the parasite. So a parasite is neither an outsider nor an insider, but rather something like an outsider on the inside who is making the inside visible in the very moment it is also rendered unstable. Or to put this perhaps in a less dense sentence, that this parasite host setup destabilizes well-known dichotomies, such as the dichotomy between inner and outer, subject and other. It introduces an element of jeu, kind of it puts in play, it also makes wobbly. So the word jeu has both significations in French. But then in the last chapter, you quote Derrida for saying that we must entertain an idea of absolute hospitality. The idea that we could move entirely outside a host-parasite framework. And this is the kind of hospitality that you go on to associate with what Derrida calls literarity. So you explain that literarity, for instance, offers an alternative to the host-parasite dialectic. So at the end of the book, the parasite host is a framework that we should try to move beyond. And I'm wondering if it means that there could be a world without parasite, perhaps even without noise. And I suspect I might be misreading you slightly here, but what I want you to say a little bit more about, or what I'll invite you to say a bit more about, is the relationship between those two frameworks, the host-parasite and then the literarity. So something I was thinking when I was reading your book was what would happen if you gave a more prominent position to the figure of the symbiont. Symbionts and symbiosis do appear in your book. First time, I think, on page 158, and then a few more times at the end, but it's not a concept that you develop in any detail. Nevertheless, given the horizon that you are aiming for, which is one of hospitality, one critical of individualism, it seems to me that a theory of symbiosis, and in particular I was thinking of Lynn Margulis's serial endosymbiosis theory, that kind of theory of symbiosis would work really well with what you're saying. It deprioritizes the cell, the idea of an identity, we might say, and it emphasizes that many major evolutionary novelties result from coexistence and combination. So I'm not asking you to improvise a theory of symbiotic urbanism, but I'm curious about whether there is something in the host-parasite framework that you want to hold on to, even at the end of your book, or if we can move out of it. And I'm also curious about whether literarity is to be seen as something like a transcendence of the host-parasite paradigm. So that was my first thing. The first one. That was the first one. Sorry. Yeah, the second one is shorter. So the second remark is about what you call a contribution to your contribution to a post-humanism of the city. So that's a formulation you use in your introduction, and it gets a more systematic development in the final chapter of the book. And that happens when you turn to the work of Derrida, but also when you turn to Rosi Braidotti and Gilles Deleuze, among others. And I think Holly will speak of Blanchot in this context as well. So here you recognize, first of all, the proximity between these different thinkers, but ultimately you end up distancing yourself from Braidotti in particular, instead using Derrida's texts to pave a way for this post-humanism of the city. So the first point, and that is not a very important point, so you can just kind of put it aside, is that I was a little bit surprised that Derrida emerges as the post-humanist in this company. I understand that an ungrounding of subjectivity takes place when we follow the textual movements that Derrida details with such care and sophistication, but I still think, and this isn't a critique, that he stays closer to the human figure than Braidotti and Deleuze, partly because he is so literature-focused, and partly because he, as far as I know, doesn't write too much about wider ecologies. But more importantly, I was curious about why you take issue with Rosi Braidotti's belief, and this is a quote that you give, that we still need some theory of the subject. And as she writes in another text, we need a subject position worthy of our times. as you explained, Braidotti's post-humanism isn't a form of individualism. She does not have in mind what is sometimes called a liberal idea of the subject, but she does believe that subjects exist and that it is important to understand these subjects in all of their dynamic entanglements, not least to be able to conserve certain ideas of political agency. And I get the sense from reading you that almost any contemporary theory of the subject would feel like a regressive step for you. Maybe I'm kind of drawing the lines up too sharply, but I think you're drawing them up quite sharply yourself. So I'm curious about why this resistance towards a theorization of the subject. So that's me. I think I'll hand over to Holly, and then you can pick up on what you want to pick up on.
Thank you, Nikolai. And thank you for such a comprehensive overview of this book, which I really enjoyed reading. It's an excellent book. I was really struck by, when I picked it up and I first started thinking about parasite and what parasite means, I just immediately went to kind of the social and biological meaning of the word. So this introduction of parasite as, the specific French meaning of the term, like a reminder of that idea of it naming interference in a communications network is fascinating, and naming that noise which distorts the message or prevents us from hearing something as clearly as it was intended. And applying that to the city, I found fascinating. And it was interesting that in your reading, that line which I'd highlighted, there is no channel without noise and no system immune to entropy, hosts are never truly whole. Taking that idea, what Max does, he takes that idea and he thinks it in the context of the city in really quite compelling ways, and within a structure of a book, which is just so kind of the chapters so neatly delineated while also kind of referring without overlapping to one another. I thought it was excellently structured. So from that starting point of, this idea of noise and of parasite as noise as kind of disturbance, you argue that urbanism and urban politics are dominated by an anti-parasitism, and you really compellingly trace the various attempts at the eradication of the parasite in Paris in particular, and you write which has never and can never be realised. From the Haussmanization of the Parisian streets, transforming into those wide and straight boulevards, to the artwork of the street artist Invader, which I recently came across completely by chance in Newcastle of all places, and found the map which you reference in your book, the Google map. So Max includes a map of there's a street artist, and he puts up little what's the game that it's Space Invader? Yeah, Space Invader, little Space Invader figures which appear on the walls throughout Paris. And that's then mapped on a Google map, which is on his website. But he's also he's branched out into other cities too, hasn't he? Yeah. So I really enjoyed the range and the breadth. I thought it was so exciting, the various topics that you cover in this book, and the structure was so clear. I think the one I want to think about noise, and in particular its relationship to literarity, as you talk about it in the final chapter. So the book builds towards this final chapter, which is called Underground, and there's a focus on literarity. You ask what an attentiveness to noise in its various forms can tell us about urban politics, about different experiences of the city and how we might think, structure, build, decorate, or graffiti, live otherwise in this place. And through an exploration of the ways in which a thinking of parasitism can be applied to from the seemingly private spaces of Paris, then to its walls, its streets, the bodies which move around it, you build to this consideration of what lies underneath the city streets in the final chapter, where you reference, as Nikolai's talked about, you reference Derrida on questions of hospitality. That question of noise and literarity, that's where I want to linger, and I'm really interested. I would like to hear you say more about how you understand that relationship, and also what you understand by literarity in this context. So you ask what it means to create what it would mean to create literary cities and to engage in literary urbanism. You explain that literarity is not an attribute reserved for novels and works of literature, but a broad concept for which maybe the term writing might be more appropriate. You write of Deleuze, for whom literarity is incompatible with the boundedness and subjectivity of the host, and also of Blanchot's notion of de-individualizing literary space. I find the suggestion of a connection between the city and literarity really exciting, and precisely for reasons that Nikolai outlined before, this kind of future-looking, forward-thinking idea of, what role for literature today. And I just wondered, kind of how we might go further with this, or if you could say a little bit more about what you understand by literarity in this context. So and this is just an example, for someone like Blanchot, Blanchot was a literary critic. That's how he started off. He's also a kind of a writer of novels, well, of works of literature, let's say, and a thinker, as he's broadly described. But for Blanchot, particularly in the 60s, the motif of the street becomes increasingly significant, and it obviously reaches its full significance in the events of May '68. But it's really closely associated with his thinking of literature. He thinks about how what interests him about the street is the way in which the human kind of can participate there in an anonymous and collective flow, hum, movement of the street, kind of not necessarily subject in an errant and unrestricted space. And it's very clear that he's kind of thinking the street alongside the way he kind of responds to kind of works of literature. It's very closely associated. So he refers to this hum, which takes place in the street, as chatter. And just a little quotation, he calls this chatter, it's maybe a scorn speech, which is never that of the resolute, laconic and heroic I, but the non-speech of the irresponsible one. One speaks. This means no one speaks. This means we live in a world where there is a speech without a subject speaking it, a civilization of speakers without speech, spokespeople who relate but do not pronounce, technicians without name and without power of decision. And I don't know, I'm really interested about this question of how you understand literarity in this context. So for Blanchot, this chatter, rather than being something degraded or inauthentic, points toward an unknowable future, which is precisely what I think you're trying to do at the end of, you are doing at the end of the book. And I wondered if this idea of chatter, as Blanchot formulates it, might be one way of thinking literary cities, or that literary urbanism which you call for, and in which everyone can engage. So I guess it's a very open question, and it's a kind of, how do you think this literarity, and is it a literarity without a hierarchy between, say, everyday speech and the literary as we more traditionally define it? Is chatter a useful way of thinking it? And then it leads me on to my final question, which is very broad and very open, and just a thought I had as I was reading through the book. I'm thinking about that chatter in which everyone might be able to engage. And one question which stayed with me as I read the book was that a lot of I think you're very attentive to this, and you very carefully recognise the ways in which the city is a gendered space, and you acknowledge, for instance, the gender politics of the maps produced by, for example, the Situationist International. But it's striking, isn't it, that, well, it's unsurprising, but striking nonetheless, that most of the references are to men, to male writers and these experiences of the city. And I'm just wondering, what space for women and non-binary people in this thinking of parasitism? What space for them in that future, maybe literary city or urban environment? Those are my two questions. How do you see that literarity? How do you understand its relation to noise? And how do we open that space up to maybe women and non-binary people?
Okay, well,
Thank you.
Thank you both for these responses and for the kind words and for reading the book so attentively and for everything you have to say. I will try to respond with the same level of erudition and insight. So I get the common question between the two of you of the literarity, etc. Let's see, how to come to that. So it wasn't something that was with me at the beginning of the book. As Nikolai said, I came to it with wanting to cover lots of media. It wasn't necessarily privileging literature in any way. I don't know if there is any poetry, actually. Oh yeah, okay. But it's a prose text. Yeah. It's a prose text by Reda. So that wasn't a kind of, I didn't come to it trying to make a defense of literature or literary cities. The idea came, if anything, I was kind of frustrated with this, fixation on poetry, fixation on the flaneur, fixation on a certain very literary way of talking about Paris in the 19th century. I think the literary came to me, the first text that made me ask the question was William Paulson's book, The Noise of Culture, which is a kind of information theory rewriting of post-structuralism. And in it, he distinguishes between instruction manuals, which you read for information and you try and sort out the noise, versus literary texts where there's no distinction or hierarchy between signal and noise. Everything is potentially signifying. There's nothing that cues you in that something is accidental. If there's a typo, maybe that's an intentional typo. Maybe I should interpret that. And so that kind of at least posed the question for me of literary writing or literary reading as a mode of relating to meaning making where you don't hierarchized between host and parasite. And the other thing that made me linger on that was Roberto Esposito's book, The Third Person, which comes after his work on immunity and community, which is connected to questions of biopower and the individual and what the political theory of immunity contributes to our understanding of the immune system. That he has this book, The Third Person, where he cites Blanchot and Deleuze, trying to articulate some way of thinking about the third through literature that bypasses the like subject-object, self-other binaries. So that was what got me started thinking about literature and then literarity. And then there's this, so in Britain, there's a movement called legible cities, which you've maybe encountered in London or Bristol, if you've seen those maps on the street where they have the circles that show you where you are and where you could walk in 15 minutes and where you could walk in 30 minutes. So legible cities is this organization. I don't know if it's the same organization across both cities or if it's just a kind of shared name. But the idea is that you should always know where you are in the city. You should always know how to get where you're going. You should always know where you're going, really. Everything should be immediately accessible and understandable. And another part of their mission statement is trying to improve urban efficiency. So tourists get to the shops faster. Workers get to the offices faster. And so legibility of the city seems to play into that kind of technocratic, informatic, efficiency-focused way of thinking about urban life. Which is the object of situationist critique, etc. So I was uncomfortable about privileging the literary for the reasons you both raised. Derrida's discomfort with the literary as being high literature or some kind of special sort of writing that's done by genius authors. I didn't want to kind of push us towards that way of thinking about the city. It was more of the literary as an alternative to this legibility. Literarity as something that disorients you, that makes it so you don't get what you don't get out of the city what you put into it. You don't get what you thought you were going to get out of it. I think your reference to the unpredictable future, the unknowable future, is exactly the sort of thing I'm thinking about. That a literary city is not necessarily like a city that reminds us of Baudelaire or Joyce or any of these people who have written the city in that way. It's literary in this destabilizing, unpredictable, decentering sort of way. And I think the hum chatter is, I didn't know that reference. I was terrified to find that you were doing this because you know Blanchot better than anybody. But I think that's an excellent reference and fits really well with my thinking. In terms of why I like Derrida maybe more than I should.
No. I didn't want to say that.
So I think Derrida, part of it is a difference between Derrida and Serre. That Serre, I think, ultimately remains very ambivalent about the parasite, that host and parasite are kind of always interchangeable. He uses this example in the book of a fable by Bourseau of the city rat and the country rat, who eat the crumbs left on the floor by a tax collector. And he points out that at the end of the story, the tax collector, who's a parasite working for the government, chases out the rats by making noise. And so we might have thought the rats were the parasites, but actually the human becomes the parasite who wins in the end. And so he likes this interchangeability. And I talk about it in the section on street art, that in the 1990s, you had artists like Zeus who were defacing billboard advertisements and disrupting the messages that corporate advertisers wanted to transmit through the city. And now you have like Microsoft doing guerrilla ad campaigns using street art and tagging street artists' work to try and pick up on the street cred. And so there's this way in which the parasite is not always necessarily the marginal figure. It's just the person who's disrupting, rerouting somebody else's speech. And I think that's really useful to think about the parasite in that way, but then it also leaves you kind of agnostic about, what it means to be marginalized. I think Serre, after writing The Parasite, in his later references to The Parasite, tends to focus on like billionaires as parasites. And so being the parasite as the marginalized, disenfranchised figure kind of gets lost. Whereas with Derrida, I think there's more of a fixation on the etymological meaning of the parasitos as the poor person amongst the rich, where the uts, the hosts and the guests are interchangeable. They have an inalienable right to attend the feast. The parasite is marked out as somebody who doesn't belong, and if they stop being entertaining, then they get thrown out. So I think Derrida helps you remain focused on the people who suffer by being labeled as parasites and the kind of political stakes of a discourse of parasitism. So that's part of why Derrida is so important at the end of the book, even though most of the rest of it is drawing on Serre. In terms of Derrida versus Deleuze or Bredati, I don't know that I like Deleuze. I find it hard to, I sometimes find it hard to work with Deleuze to make declarative statements using Deleuze. So maybe that explains why the conclusions are more connected to Derrida. I think my issue with Bredati, I really like Posthuman. I really like Bredati's work. I think when she talks about cities, she talks about a kind of city that I'm very opposed to. That what I don't get in the Posthuman is that she ends up with the defense of like the smart city and a kind of smart, open, I don't know, she seems very uncritical about the techno-surveillance apparatus of contemporary urbanism. And so I find it hard to reconcile that with her critique of humanism and her version of subjectivity. And I think I sort of feel that sometimes she ends up reverting back to a fairly conventional humanist idea of the subject, and that's part of why she ends up defending smart urbanism. So that's why I don't engage with Bredati as much as I perhaps could. So yes, so those are some thoughts about literarity and the post-humanism of the city and why Derrida is important to me. The symbiosis question, I totally agree. Yes, I think symbiosis is I think it's in the book. My only qualm about it is a version of symbiosis that preserves the self and other as autonomous subjects. I can't remember who. I think it's Margaret McFall Guy, who prefers to say complex consortia of something or other instead of saying symbionts, because symbiont might make you think that there's still me and then my gut microbiome, instead of thinking it as an ecology that incorporates lots of different life forms that are moving into and out of each other, and where it's very difficult to draw a line between them. But I am strongly in favor of a symbiotic urbanism. I think that that's a very lovely idea, as long as it pushes us to think of connection and relationality instead of allowing us to slip back into a thinking of self and other, but telling ourselves that we're being more open without actually doing it. And then, so I guess, well, I don't know if that takes us to the question about gendered space, but we'll pretend that that's a segue. Yeah, so I think one way to think about the book from my perspective is a real optimism born of maybe a moment around 2010 when it seemed like a lot of urban power structures were breaking down, that suddenly you had this explosion of street art and these mass protests on a scale that people hadn't seen before, that maybe were being enabled by digital technologies and different kinds of community and all of these weird semi-virtual games like parkour that were pushing people to transgress the rules that had been governing the city up to then. And it seemed like that was maybe a kind of revenge of Situationist International, that suddenly there was going to be this all these different ways to challenge the power structures of the city. And then over time, each of them gets kind of absorbed back into capitalism. And so, yeah, I started looking at street art, and I thought, oh, street art is, this thing. Suddenly people are making art. It's public. They don't care about property. They don't care about who owns it. They just want to kind of share these things with the city, appropriate the city. But then when you look down at it, when you look at the people doing it, it's almost exclusively men, almost exclusively white men, which makes sense because they run much less risk doing it. And a similar thing happens with parkour, that it ends up sort of like giving you the sense that there's this possibility for everybody to move through the city however they want, and you don't just have to cross the street when they tell you to. You can climb over the walls, but in practice it's almost all white men, because there's, yeah.
And probably young people.
And young people, able-bodied. Parkour is, well, anyway, I've talked for long enough. So that's one of the, on the one hand, the book is this critique of a modernist approach to architecture that has these kind of eugenic undertones of trying to design for the ideal man, and like Le Corbusier, his modular system where all of architecture will be based on the proportions that really are the proportions of a 6-foot-tall athletic European male. So trying to push back against that, trying to make space in the city for other kinds of bodies, and finding these practices that seem on the surface to be really transgressive and decentered and open to everyone, but that for some reason only end up attracting the same people who've enjoyed freedom in the city to begin with. So yes, that is, in terms of how to, I don't really have an answer to like how to reverse that, other than, I have my frustration with these practices.
Yeah. I wasn't looking for an answer. I think that was an excellent kind of overview. Yeah, I think the book is very attentive to that. Like it wasn't a criticism of the book in any way.
And I think I sort of regret not doing something with Cléo de 5 à 7, and thinking about the female body in the street, possibly diseased, and what that tells us about the relationship of the body to the parasite in modern Paris. But maybe it'll be an article one day.
I'm very happy with these answers. I don't want to push anything in particular. I do want to say, kind of getting back to some of the things that Wes said in the introduction, that one of the things that is so fantastic about this book, and I try to kind of suggest that, is the kind of the performative dimension of it, in the sense that it is an extremely hospitable book. It is a book that works with relationality and shows that thinking is about relations, and what you manage to do is to for instance, say new things about text that I feel that I knew very well, like Hanneke's Cachet, a film from 2005, and kind of your way of thinking that in a new relational web kind of opened up things that I had not thought about, despite having kind of watched that film multiple times and taught it as well. So it works extremely well. Were you ever tempted to do chronology, or how did you kind of, because I think it's fantastic you're not doing that, but that would have been the easier way of structuring, and I'm kind of thinking this must have been such a challenge to make the cuts so it fitted a chapter structure.
No, I wasn't tempted. Well, I think, I can't remember the number, but I read once how many books have been published about Paris, and it was an insane, it was, like 30,000 or something. I don't know. It was a made up number. And so I kind of felt permission to not tell a historical, chronological version of the story. And I think the way my brain works is more around these kinds of juxtapositions and analogies. So it suited me. And I also thought, like, even the chapter Apartment, which is about kind of the most historical chronological chapter tracing how public health exerted a bigger and bigger influence on French urbanism across the 19th century and into the 20th century, and how that eventually began to overlap with thinking about the city as a media system and thinking about the place of communication technologies within the city. I feel quite uncomfortable with how linear it is. I don't know. There's something about the linear history that feels kind of overly simplistic and unidirectional to me, and the comparisons feel, I don't know. Analogies across time works better for me. I feel more at ease with that.
Noisier.
Yeah. Noisier. Yeah.
I really enjoyed how you can have a paragraph where you move between Victor Hugo, say, and then parkour in one paragraph. It's brilliant. I was just going to ask about is it okay?
Yeah.
Sorry. About the underground spaces. You know, at the end, you kind of discuss underground spaces. What is it about underground spaces in particular? You know, what's the name of the river? Sorry, the river flowing.
Bièvre.
Yeah, and you discussed that earlier on. I wondered, do you have a favourite underground space that you know?
People, whenever I talk about this book, somebody in the audience is like, "Oh yeah, my friend goes into the catacombs. I know somebody who has keys to the underground access tunnels, and they always promise they're going to take me. Nobody ever takes me." Yeah, I think the Bièvre blew my mind. The fact that there's another river in Paris. I love that thought.
And that it can be traced by the buildings that are kind of built over it or lower levels. So you provide a
Yeah, there's a movement to uncover it as part of greening the city, bringing more nature back. It was covered in the early 20th century, I think, because there was so much pollution that the smell was unbearable. But it runs through the left bank. Yeah, I like that idea. I think the underground, it's in the book, but it seems maybe it's on the path towards being more mapped and more understood and more like the city above ground, but it still seems to have some kind of mystery and magic. And we were talking, and some of my students are here, we were talking recently about the cinema that was found in one of the abandoned quarries under the city. There's something magical and exciting about that I think taps into that like literary unexpected quality.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we should ask the listeners to contribute with questions. Are there questions from the room? Please.
No, I don't think you're wrong. I would like it to be translatable to other cities. I'm going to trap myself into actually writing this article, but I'm working on. So there are two Francophone novels that I teach that both center on municipal public health officials who are trying to get different kinds of parasites out of their cities. One of them, La Grève des Battus by Aminata Sofal, which is about a Senegalese person trying to get rid of all the beggars from the city. And the other is another book. So I talk about Rachid Bouchetra's novel Topographie Idéale, which is set in Paris. He has another book called L'escargot entêté, which is about a public health official who's obsessed with killing all the rats in his city. So I'm trying to work through how these ideas would work in a post-colonial context and how they fit with other theories of post-colonial urbanism without wanting to kind of impose a Eurocentric, Paris-centric, metropolitan vision of the city on them. I guess with Oxford you have less of that problem. I would hope that it applies to Oxford. I think that questions about inclusion, the discussion of homelessness in the section on the street, I think these questions are certainly relevant to the city. There's nowhere that loves a secret hidden door that you don't have the keys to more than Oxford does. Yeah, those are excellent questions. Thank you. So the parkour and the lights, there's a recent article in the New York Times that I recommend you read about this. I don't know if it's a campaign or I haven't thought about it too deeply. I think I like it as an application for parkour, especially compared to the more like virtuosic isn't the word, but these like heroic parkour feats where it's mostly about creating videos that will get lots of hits on YouTube for monetary gain. There's something pleasingly Good Samaritan about just turning off lights. So I think I approve of that. In terms of the question of the hearing impaired and otherwise disabled in the city, that's a really, really rich question. So I would say there are multiple forms of noise. So I don't think deafness necessarily dispenses you from the noise of the city. It may be separates you from the audible noise of the city. But if we think of noise in terms of like the city as media system and what is information loss within the system, then there are forms of disorientation and whatever that it would be a question of translation, understanding what it's like. I guess it comes down to different perceptions of the city. My mom was in a wheelchair her whole life. The book is dedicated to my mom. Yeah, I was very attentive growing up to ramps and general access concerns in that way, and the experiential differences and the ways it changes your perception of space. But I don't have a particularly interesting answer other than I think it's about, there's a different perceptual world with different things that constitute the signal, different things that constitute the noise, different feelings of different ways of being excluded, and that it would be nice to construct cities that were not so exclusive in that way. Yeah, I think like COVID fits with Serre's ideas really well, the importance of misinformation in terms of aiding the spread of the disease, something that seemed initially like it would flatten social hierarchies, but actually proved to reveal the fault lines of society, prejudicially affected the poor and the marginalized. In terms of how it relates to the city, the first thing that comes to mind is the spectacle of dump trucks going down urban boulevards and cascading disinfectant onto the streets, which didn't accomplish anything other than it did have an effect. It's not just hygiene theater in the sense of something that is just to make us feel better. It also killed lots of animals and plants and other forms of life. So I think that's a place where, this like anti-parasitic impulse, this comforting gesture of detoxing all of the surfaces was noxious for cleaning staff, urban workers who were exposed to the chemicals, and hugely damaging for urban wildlife. So there is another way of controlling the city that incorporates an ecological thinking that thinks about our relation to other animals and not just our relationship to the virus. But yeah, the bit of the question about the city being quieter during COVID is really interesting. I don't know. I was one of the people who was completely charmed when the goats turned up in the middle of cities. I think that there's something beautiful about how quickly wildlife returned to urban spaces. And Seth and I were talking about this last week, that there was studies in America that showed that songbirds altered the pitch of their songs because they no longer had to compete with the cars. And so in less than a generation, very quickly, the soundscape of the natural world and the distribution of animals changed noticeably. So I suppose, if nothing else, then there's a quite optimistic thought in that. One, it tells us that there are interactions taking place on all kinds of levels between sound and noise and our dialogue with plants and animals. And it also shows that these relationships are available to change. I mean, certainly there's a link between tourism and the ecology of the city. I don't know if I would say tourism is parasitic, because that sounds pejorative to me. That sounds like that's saying that we as native-born residents of the city have an authentic right to it, and that people visiting from other places don't. And so I would rather avoid that kind of nativist thinking about who has a right to the city's resources. But yeah, I suppose it would have to be balanced with with other questions about other species and their access to the city and everything related to that.
Okay, so it's 2 o'clock now, so I think we should probably close the session. And thanks, many thanks to Max for speaking so well about the book, which is a fantastic and exciting book that we strongly recommend that you go and purchase. So yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you.